How do you personally define trauma?
If I were to define trauma broadly, it would be anything that takes us out of our center so that we feel like we can't really be or be ourselves.
A significant amount of human beings are walking around with some kind of trauma.
Trauma of having somebody leave you and divorce you, this is losing all your money. I mean, these can be very traumatic experiences.
I would say I was born in trauma.
My mother's Caucasian, my father's African American, so being a mixed child.
I couldn't brush my teeth, I couldn't open up jars, I can't really get dressed.
And I think it is sadly very common for traumatized people to blame themselves.
I would just go upstairs in our closet in our bedroom, and I would lock myself in the closet.
I came from this family that was fragmented because of alcoholism.
And the car flipped 4 times, and all of the boys were not wearing seatbelts and were thrown from the car.
People usually feel held captive in those situations, helpless. They can't do anything about it oftentimes.
My sister was kidnapped and sexually assaulted.
He had a temporary job, but he lost that, and he committed suicide.
How do you possibly live with the reality you were sexually abused by family members?
We don't learn much about trauma. We don't talk about it.
It's about what we can be. Be the change, live the change, and ultimately see the change.
And we just keep repeating this pattern until we face it, feel it, heal it.
You don't have to use the trauma as an excuse to get attention. You use it as a learning tool.
That's a valuable lesson in navigating tragedy, that you have choices.
What I thought was the worst thing in my life, it's turned out to be one of the best.
All the answers are within you. But there are moments and times we all need support.
Trauma can be used as this tremendous opportunity for deep healing, learning, and growth.
When I look at my trauma, I see it as a blessing.
There's no such thing as hopelessness, just hopeless people.
Hello and welcome to the Trauma docuseries. I'm Dr. Pedram Shojai, New York Times bestselling author and filmmaker of several films and series focused on health and wellness.
And I'm Nick Palizzi, founder of The Sacred Science and producer of several documentaries and docuseries.
We are so excited to present the Trauma series to you. It's the result of thousands of collective hours of research, clinical studies, wisdom, knowledge, and healing.
If you watched our last series on exhaustion, we should warn you, this one's a bit more challenging. We're going to explore some dark moments in people's lives, maybe even your own, but all in the name of healing and pushing ourselves forward to a fuller, more connected life.
This 9-part series is the most comprehensive, dramatic, inspirational, and healing experience ever produced on the topic of trauma.
Each episode is packed full of insight from leading experts in trauma healing, healthcare professionals, and the stories of the devastating fall and inspiring rise of brave victims of trauma.
We all experience trauma in life, in different ways and to varying degrees. Trauma is everywhere. And just for that reason, it can often be overlooked or trivialized.
But that doesn't lessen its effect on us. Traumatic events, whether big or small, happen. They're impossible to avoid, and they alter the course of our lives, whether we know it or not.
For the most part, trauma is something that happens on a personal level. But every so often, something happens on a societal level that's not just a traumatic event, but a catalyst for millions of traumatic events.
That's something we've seen in recent times with COVID-19. The global pandemic created literally billions of unique traumatic experiences, and in many ways, this traumatic fallout is more widespread than the virus itself.
Over the course of this series, we'll explore the nature of trauma, break down the ways it alters our lives, and, most importantly, help you find the right tools to put yourself on a path towards healing.
Trauma can be an intense experience of mental, physical, or sexual trauma. It can also be much more subtle, a moment of disappointment or neglect. Our personal traumas literally dictate how we view the world and how we interact with it. We're not just talking about behavioral changes. Trauma can change us on a cellular level, but we'll dig into that later. Here's Pedram to start us off on our healing journey.
Understanding our trauma is the key to overcoming it, and that's what this series aims to do. With powerful firsthand accounts from people who are on their journey towards healing and the support of leading doctors and healthcare professionals, this series will help you understand or maybe identify your own traumas. More importantly, it'll guide you towards ways to heal from them. Those are the first steps towards living your life free of the pain that may have taken charge of your life. We begin with some overall highlights from our 9-part series.
Well, trauma for me is very personal. First off, I've suffered trauma in just about every conceivable way a human being could. But the way I like to look at trauma in myself, in my own healing, was there was physical trauma that needed to be dealt with, emotional trauma, mental trauma, and spiritual trauma. And I find that most people that suffer profound trauma have one or all of those areas compromised.
So big T trauma is when a specific event happens that's very frightening and disturbing. For example, if you get in a car accident or experience some kind of assault, and that can leave ruptures in your mind and in your body for a long time if it's not healed and worked through.
I, fortunately and unfortunately, had a big T trauma where I had the death of a loved one, a parent, my mom, when I was in school, of breast cancer.
A number of years ago, I had 4 strains of Lyme disease. It was in my brainstem, my spinal cord. I had hundreds of parasites in my body that put holes in my organs, ate away my endocrine glands. The parasites, when they die, they release viruses, bacteria, fungus, and neurotoxins. And one of the viruses that they released was a very rare virus that causes leukemia.
In 2000, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and went relentlessly downhill. By 2003, I'm unable to sit up in a regular chair like I am now. I'm in a tilt recline wheelchair. By 2006, I'm beginning to have trouble with brain fog. In 2007, I'm on the verge of being forced into medical retirement.
Many years ago, almost 20 years ago, I was in a horrible car accident that nearly took my life. I was riding on a scooter on my way to work one day, and I was hit by a car. And it threw me through the air, like 10 feet. I hit the ground. I dislocated my shoulder. I broke 3 ribs. And at the time, I actually didn't realize it, but I had suffered a concussion, like a mild concussion. And so afterwards, I was left in chronic pain. I had pretty much given up hope on like any chance for healing because I tried many things within conventional medicine and nothing worked.
Every day, I work with people who've had some pretty awful traumatic events. It really became their pivot moment for way greater things in their lives. Through their trauma, they found their greater purpose. And they realized that that traumatic event, after processing it and dealing with it and putting it where it needed to be, which was behind them in a healthy way, they have done incredible things.
But you can also have what's called little t trauma, which is developmental trauma, meaning as our brains were growing as children, our parents didn't give us quite what we needed at each of our developmental stages or any one of our developmental stages. And that is its own kind of trauma. To reach out for care and not get it is a trauma. And especially when it happens over and over and over again. And then we learn, well, you know what? We just don't get care. So that's a kind of trauma. That's the little t trauma.
And the reality is that trauma can start from the moment you and I pop out the womb. Birth trauma alone is a highly underrated, understudied experience in terms of what's happening in the hospital, what's happening to mama, what kinds of drugs are entering the system, was there a C-section, Were you yanked out in a way that didn't work?
My original trauma or my original wound has everything to do with the fact that my father was an alcoholic. And so there's lots of research out there in terms of, what it means to be an adult child of an alcoholic and, that it's actually a legitimate stressor or traumatic experience.
There are definitely couples I see who have experienced real significant trauma in childhood, but there's a lot of couples who downplay what happened in their childhood. They say, oh, it was no big deal, but it's had a lasting impact. And in my practice, I think it's really crucial to understand that what happened in childhood has a lasting impact on you, whether or not it feels like it was traumatic at the time. The impact is reverberating, into the present time.
Parents are only able to bring in what they've had experienced themselves. Some parents make conscious choices to either be exactly the opposite of what they've experienced. My mom did that. Like, she didn't have a nurturing, experience, so she therefore decided that she was going to be the nurturer, and so you have situations like that. But most times we are only equipped with what our experience has been.
Transgenerational trauma is one of the biggest phenomenons in my medical career that blew my mind. It was really interesting to find out that there are epigenetic changes that happen when the trauma is experienced by a mother that are passed on to her children.
But epi is on top of genetics, and so it's that idea that what happens in your life can actually change the genetic structure. So an example of that is that somebody can pass down a gene from their own experience to the next generation, and it's transmuted, it's changed, it's been mutated in some way so that it is not the same gene, and they're much more reacting to what that other person's trauma was. And again, often it's not conscious, it's not discussed.
Many people have traumatic childhood experiences. And in the absence of reframing the story around that trauma, the child's view of that trauma often stays stuck in us. So being able to take a view of that trauma from an supported adult perspective and recognize that there's the part of our being that was a child that still wants to be comforted about that, wants to know that I'm in a safe world today, that there's a mature being with me who's going to protect me and provide for me. And that's a journey to take in regard to healing that trauma. One of the things that ultimately really helps is not deny the story, but reduce the number of times you keep telling the story.
If the trauma, the hurt, the pain gets lodged in the mind, in our consciousness, then it in turn is going to get stuck somewhere in our body. And if it's not dealt with in the body, it's going to turn into disease. And because it's misalignment happening in the physical body that over time is going to break down the body, and it's going to fall into disease.
So we can have acute trauma. We can have trauma that goes in waves. It comes and goes based on your triggers. And then we have consistent trauma, where it's PTSD, where somebody is constantly feeling like they're being under attack. So signs and symptoms can vary.
After my last deployment, I started to have new problems that had never been apparent or existed before. And it came with extreme fatigue and loss of libido, and then I started to have some behavioral issues. Started to just become overwhelmed with depression. And I was living the life I wanted to live as a Special Forces operator. I was married to the woman of my dreams. We had the family we wanted, but I'm swimming in this new sea of depression. And for the life of me, it didn't add up.
In the military, when you have people who are generally very courageous and able to kind of go through and face events that most of us would be frightened to go through, after a traumatic event of being, on the front lines or being in a military situation, they get traumatized and then they come back into civilization, and that courage is now being questioned.
There's no system in place to come back to to reintegrate yourself into normal life. Because when you're not deployed, you're just doing training and you're going on school trips and you're working and going back to your families. There is an attempt for the military to have you write down what you've done. Do you have any issues? But if you admit to those, then they're going to start questioning whether you have the ability to remain in that job. So when we bring it and we hold it inside of ourselves, and we're too warrior or manly to talk about it with our other teammates, it starts to build up. And some people get affected by it a lot more or a lot worse than others.
I was on the phone with people in the trade towers when 9/11 and the planes were going. And so I've got all these people like screaming in the phone. And meanwhile, I can see what's happening. They have no idea what's good. Like, it's just all of this stuff going on. And not only that, but I worked in telecommunications. And so at the company that I worked for, we had massive amounts of TVs everywhere. So, because we always needed to know what was going on. So on every pillar in the room, there was a TV on each side. And so I'm seeing with sensory information, the planes hit, and then all these people are screaming on the phone, like, what's going on? There's all this chaos. And it was just, and so my mind was taking in information, and the only thing I'm concerned about is them, but, it created a trauma in my mind. And of course, I'm just going, oh my God, I want to help these people. This isn't about me.
The world is a much smaller place now, so we are constantly being bombarded with information about everyone else's experience and what's going on in the world. And a lot of places we may never see physically or ever be, we can see what's going on for those people. And what we begin to see is not only is there a sort of personal sense of trauma in terms of interacting with the world and too much coming in, but there's a sort of social sense of trauma that people are recognizing now, that groups of people are sharing traumatic experiences.
I think what's really interesting is the connection between trauma and our way of eating, because sometimes we can't control something. Like if there's this trauma that's happened in the past, it's something that we can't control, and we try to control something else. So a lot of times we see our clients will try to control their eating, which might end up turning into some sort of restrictive eating disorder or even just restrictive eating patterns, because they're trying to grasp onto what they can. And another thing is people will oftentimes use food as a coping mechanism or a numbing mechanism, and without actually addressing the underlying trauma in your body, without actually feeling into that and healing that, it can just be this vicious cycle then of trying to control and restrict food intake, and then that can cause more stress on the body, and the stress that you're causing on your body can increase your cortisol levels, and the increase in cortisol can cause weight gain. So then you try to control even more, and it just turns into this vicious cycle that's really difficult to get out of without actually dealing with the underlying trauma.
Relational trauma just means trauma that happens in a relationship, trauma between people. One of the hardest kinds of trauma, really, because when we know that someone has or if we feel that someone has an intent to hurt us, it usually has more impact than an accident or something like that.
We've gotten kicked so hard by the people we trust the most. I mean, think about it. When the people we trust the most prove untrustworthy, who do we trust? When the ones we'd run to when other people are causing harm are the ones causing the harm, where do we go?
Really, my healing began at the age of 16. I had a child that was taken from me through the Mormon church. And when my son turned 18, he came back to live with me. And all of a sudden, my trauma was sitting in my living room.
Character strengths comes from the field of positive psychology. This is a movement that is growing, and it's going away from the clinical psychology model, which was what's wrong with you and how are we going to treat what's wrong with you. Instead, positive psychologists look at what is the best about the human condition. And a number of years ago, in the 90s, to find that out, they looked at, and they meaning Martin Seligman, Chris Peterson, went around the world and spent many years doing some research, and they looked at religions, philosophies, looked at theories of psychology, looked at different cultures, and developed 24 essential strengths.
I think it's like an onion, a continual process of we deal with the layer that we have in that moment. You only work with what you can work with in the moment that you're working with.
The interesting thing about trauma is that, yeah, for me, it sucked. I got in a car accident. It ruined my life for a long time, and it was very traumatic. It was very traumatic for me. But through that experience, when I faced it head on, I acknowledged what happened. I acknowledged what happened to myself. Deep, profound healing happened. So I just want to share this with everyone watching out there. It's like, even if you've been traumatized and you've had a concussion or a head injury or any type of trauma, physical, mental, emotional, there's so much that can be done about it. And once that is addressed, profound, deep healing, learning, and growth can happen.
You are not your trauma. It's an experience, and there's wisdom in there, there's gold in there, and it's not going to happen right away. There's each person is unique. I've worked with women that have been raped, and they're resilient, and I've worked with women whose dad happened to see them naked, and they're traumatized for life. So trauma is trauma, and each person experiences it differently.
It's important to not re-traumatize ourselves, to not pick the scabs and re-wound ourselves over and over again by going back to that initial insult. It's also important to deal with what comes up as it comes up, to the degree that it's coming up. Not make it more than it is, not make it less than it is, but allow and be with as it is to the best of your ability in that moment, with the level of education and maturity and opportunity and assistance that you have available to you in that moment.
Wow. That's some powerful stuff. And consider it a sample of the content and stories we'll be taking deeper dives into over the course of this series. At its core, trauma is a negative experience that affects our outlook on life. If left unchecked, the traumas we endure will stick with us for life, and it could impact our mental and physical health, as well as our relationships with the outside world and with the people in our lives. Our goal here is to help you find the tools you need to move past that trauma, find its meaning, and advance your quality of life. Let's take a look at some of the key things we just learned. Big T trauma is caused by a specific life-changing event. It can be frightening, disturbing, violent, injuring your body and/or your mind. Little T trauma is about the unmet needs experienced during the years of childhood development. It can have a profound and lasting impact on our lives. Trauma is believed to cause epigenetic changes in a person that can be passed on to their children and future generations. There is increasing evidence that unresolved trauma in the mind can cause disease in the body. Everyone reacts differently to trauma. Signs and symptoms vary from person to person. The information age now exposes us to more societal trauma around the world than ever before. Food is often used as a coping or numbing mechanism to deal with trauma. Relational trauma, trauma between people, is one of the hardest kinds of trauma. Identifying and acknowledging your trauma is the first step to deep healing, learning, and growth.
Before we go any further, we want to ask you to share this series with your friends and family. This free screening is an exclusive event that ends in a few days. Each episode is up for only 24 hours. Now is the time to invite your loved ones so they don't miss a second of this life-saving material. Do them a favor and give them the gift of healing. Please take a moment to share this series far and wide right now. Thank you.
To me, this signature strength card theory is intriguing.
Sandra is just one of the many trauma healers in our series who have dedicated their lives to helping others after enduring traumas of their own.
So, we reviewed what trauma is, but that's like saying we just defined what a bird is. There's over 15,000 species of birds, and yes, they're warm-blooded, egg-laying vertebrae with wings that can fly, but what kind of bird?
Birds?
Hey man, I had eggs for breakfast. Give me a break.
It's true. Trauma is a broad term for many different types of events that can derail our worldview. Over the course of this series, we'll learn about various traumas we may encounter.
But no matter what kind of trauma we experience, the effect it has on our bodies is consistent. Trauma sets our bodies into overdrive. It releases chemicals that have helped us survive since the beginning of humanity. In many ways, it's a relic to our past. Our bodies go into shock as a means of survival to sustain life. Unfortunately, healing from trauma is not required to sustain life, but it is required for living. And there's a difference. Here's Nick to take a look at the various types of trauma.
Big T trauma, little t trauma, emotional, physical, societal, even birth trauma. We might not experience all of these types of trauma in our lifetimes, hopefully we don't, but it is guaranteed that we will experience some of them. And each one, no matter how big or small, has the potential to stop us in our tracks.
Trauma, in my mind, is the initial and the long-lasting effects of a situation in someone's life where they are out of control, they don't have a choice about what's happening, and it's difficult, and feelings of lostness, feelings of hopelessness, feelings of this is happening to me and I can't stop it.
Trauma, to me, it's a scar, emotional and a physical scar, and something happened in the past. And you can heal by consciousness, including, effort, but also moving the physical body that can help your mental, scar.
I think it's a difficult, distressing, experience. It doesn't necessarily have to be physical, but that can play in a role to it. Just a very, very difficult, situation that you experience or live through.
I believe we have, most of us, let me actually say all of us at some level, have various traumas in our lives. The trauma of being born, the trauma of having somebody leave you and divorce you, this is losing all your money. I mean, these can be very traumatic experiences. And then there are major traumas that are significantly impactful, not only in our thinking, but also in our nervous system. They can cause us to react for years to come if we don't know how to transform those reactions that get stored in the nervous system.
Since our approach to trauma is essentially symptomatic, we say, okay, what caused these symptoms? Was it physical abuse? Was it neglect? Was it emotional abuse? Was it sexual abuse? In other words, did something identifiable happen that is now leading to these symptoms?
If we think of the body as a kind of wondrous symphony of systems, really working with each other in a splendid kind of life-sustaining harmony, trauma is an assault to that system that overwhelms its capacity to come back into its own flow. It can happen in an instant, it can be a prolonged kind of situation, but in its essence, it's something that overwhelms the body's natural, intrinsic ability to self-regulate.
Trauma is held in the part of the brain called the amygdala, the emotional center. And when you're doing something terrifying or that requires concentration, you move your energy towards the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. And the brain can't have dual activation. It can't be in two places at once. This is the principle behind this form of therapy called EMDR that involves eye movement. So you're thinking about whatever is upsetting to you, and then you're either following a stick or some kind of light, and you're like looking back and forth. So by trying to do two things at once, the brain can't hold both. So whatever the traumatic thought is kind of subsides.
I think every human being experiences trauma on a daily basis in small doses. perhaps it's less the singular incidents that happen, but what do we make those incidents mean in our lives? And do we have the ability to integrate the experience and move through it and move beyond it? I think for many people, especially if you're experiencing recurring trauma that happens over and over again, or subtle trauma that's happening over a long period of time, we don't have the ability to absorb it. We don't have the ability to even always recognize what has happened to us.
So every child has had trauma. Don't get picked for the baseball team. Don't get to sit with who you wanted to in the cafeteria. You know, if you're a girl and you had 3 girlfriends one day at recess and the next day they've turned against you. You know, these are experiences every child has in some way. Fail a test that you thought you aced. You know, just feeling traumatized by the fact that you didn't achieve what it was that, or your expectation. So it sets the biochemistry, the neurochemistry off into a feeling of, I'm not going to survive this. And that then creates all kinds of problems downstream.
Well, trauma for me is very personal. First off, I've suffered trauma in just about every conceivable way a human being could. But the way I like to look at trauma in myself, in my own healing, was there was physical trauma that needed to be dealt with, emotional trauma, mental trauma, and spiritual trauma. And I find that most people that suffer profound trauma have one or all of those areas compromised.
We're trying to identify trauma here, which is a big topic, right? One of the areas we're focusing on in this series is physical trauma. I know this is something you've lived through. As much as you're comfortable, can you share your experience of it?
I was taking vacation, and the first day of vacation in California, I was in a passenger seat, and we were going to Yosemite, and the yellow Mustang came from the side and hit our car from my side, and the car spun 3 times, and everything was slow motion, and I could see everything. And I even started thinking about, should I tell my parents about this? Or who can take care of my students? Because I'm going to be in a hospital. Who's going to pay the insurance? And everything was a slow motion. And I just couldn't believe how slow everything was. And then when the car stopped, I started checking myself if I'm still alive, if my body's still there. And that's when everything just came back to normal speed.
My first major trauma in my life, and it has significantly impacted my life. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, had a high school experience like young girls dream about. I was class vice president on the drill team, had a lead in the junior play, homecoming princess my junior year in high school. My high school boyfriend comes home from college, I get pregnant. December 1, my son is born. May 1, I graduate with a diploma from Washington Evening High School. And in July, I'm in an intensive care ward in a Portland hospital diagnosed with fatal kidney disease.
Emotional trauma is a wide-ranging topic that can have a lot of branches. Sometimes something physical can occur first and then cause the emotional trauma. Can you share your personal story and walk us through your journey?
When I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis when I was 30, which was about 24 years ago, I had to really do that, sit down, figure out like what's going on. Am I going to have to take drugs for the rest of my life that have terrible side effects, or can I figure out what's going on? I discovered yoga, I discovered Ayurvedic medicine, and I learned how to meditate. And one day as I was meditating, I was seeing this word autoimmune dance in front of my third eye space. You know, I was looking at it and I was thinking, autoimmune? That means I'm attacking myself. So that was a really important question. Why am I killing myself? Instead of how do I get out of my suffering as quickly as possible? So I went back and I followed this sort of breadcrumb trail all the way back in my timeline, and I landed on this 10-year-old little girl version of myself, and I was being sexually abused by the vice principal of my elementary school.
Emotional trauma would seem to be where our emotions get caught in a tape loop. We revisit the situation over and over again. And this has a lot, of course, to do with brain chemistry and our fight, flight, freeze syndrome. Emotional trauma can be healed, and I truly believe fully healed, when people find meaning and value and something that allows them to be greater than they were before, a new way of responding emotionally to life, and a new way then to share that with others.
Special forces in and of itself, lend yourself to a lot of different traumatic type of experiences, combat being one of them. One of them I can think about that's kind of been highly publicized was I was only knocked out in my career once, but it was brief. And so we were in Afghanistan on a mission, kind of between a rock and a hard place. But long story short, we're in close proximity to an explosion. Went off. We were so close to it that it knocked me out. And I came to from that explosion, and I didn't really know, where I was or what was going on. I was daylight, and then I just became engulfed in complete and utter darkness. And so when I came to in that dark situation, I had no frame of reference. Like, I didn't know where I was, what I was doing. I thought maybe I was in a building and maybe like an earthquake happened. And so I was like, oh man, maybe like the building's about to collapse. So I put my hands up to try to feel around me to see if I could feel any debris or walls or anything. I'm like, no, I don't feel anything. So I'm trying to gather my spatial orientation, and then rocket-propelled grenades started coming and exploding in close proximity, and bullets were kind of whizzing and flying by. So that kind of triggered me back into the situation. So basically, I woke up, I got up, and I went back to work. With my team was depending on me with their lives to do my job. So that's just one example of a normal day in a life.
I know emotional trauma is the most difficult thing to speak about, so thank you for being here. We're hoping that what you and others share in the series will bring hope and guidance to those in need. Can you tell us of your emotional trauma?
My son and 3 of his good friends went on a road trip to, we live in Seattle, and they were going to an area called Leavenworth to go whitewater rafting. And they never made it. They were late, and their dad was trying to pass a semi truck, and another car turned in from a side street, and to avoid a head-on collision, he went off-road, and then there was a telephone pole that he veered to miss, and the car flipped 4 times, and all of the boys were not wearing seatbelts and were thrown from the car. My son Max was killed on impact. His best friend Nico died 2 months later, and his friend Leo died 4 months later from traumatic brain injuries. And I used to always say that, everything was okay as long as my kids were okay. I have a daughter as well. And the irony that the night before, we'd just gotten back from a family trip, and we took those boys out to see a movie and to dinner, and one of them, they were all in 5th grade together. They were talking about a 5th grade teacher who'd lost a child in a car accident. And I remember thinking that night before, like, oh my God, how would you live with that? Like, how could you do that?
To begin to understand something as devastating and complex as trauma, we tend to categorize, break things down into smaller parts. Here we're looking at emotional, physical, and societal trauma. And you're someone who's been through all 3. What was your first experience with trauma?
I was born in trauma. What does that mean? Well, I was born in Europe during the Second World War, and we were in Poland, and my parents had left Latvia and Estonia because of the politics. The communists were taking it over. And so I was born in Poland. It was part of Germany at the time. My background was German-Swedish. And at the end of the war, we were refugees. I was 2 years old. We were refugees fleeing from the communists, chasing us in tanks and trucks. And the Allies were shooting at us from planes. So they were shooting at the refugees. They knew they were refugees because everybody was just getting out of there. And I don't remember a lot of it other than anxiety, fear, terror, hunger, confusion, chaos. I got left behind, abandonment, that kind of stuff. Obviously, and then for many years as a child, I was very shy. I never felt safe. Part of the reason I got into how things work, science, how do things work, because I wanted to know what I could depend on, because I didn't feel I had much that I could depend on.
As we continue across the series with these and other stories, what can we expect to discover about emotional, physical, and societal trauma?
I feel like one of the ones the way we find out about trauma that's often disconcerting is, we'll have an experience that reminds us or that triggers that memory or that original trauma. And then from that trigger, then there may be a memory that resurfaces, or it may just be an emotion or neuroses or some kind of phobia or something emerges and bubbles up to the surface a lot of times when something that reminds us of that event triggers it. So that can actually be an experience, that can actually be meeting a person, that can be a smell, it can be a song, so there are all these different things that can trigger a traumatic experience. And so a lot of times that's what happens. Other times people go into therapy and they go into treatment and they may begin the process of, digging and unpacking, and they may discover something that is there. And there are different kinds of traumas, but the kinds of traumas that happen particularly in early childhood, to stay with that thread, most of the time those things can be unconscious, and so there could be traumatic experience that we've had in early childhood that we just simply don't remember. And that's the reason why, because the psyche does a very good job of protecting us. And if we dissociated, right, meaning we came out of body, we popped out, we were not there, again, an avoidant protective mechanism of the psyche, then there really may not be a memory of it because we weren't even there. Part of us had left the building, so to speak.
When a traumatic event happens in a person's life, all of their foundation, their constructs of how they operate in the world can be completely changed, completely shaken, if you will. I think it's important that we remember that every person we're encountering has had events in their lives that didn't go the way they wanted. Maybe we didn't get the Christmas present or the holiday present or the birthday present that we were wanting. Maybe we were having an expectation we'd have a different relationship with our parents than the one we had. Maybe our partner died and we didn't have an opportunity to say goodbye to them, or our child died, or communication had stopped with them.
To get out of those traumas, you have to go to a place that is also part of your being, that cannot be affected by trauma, and that place exists in every human being, no matter what they've been through.
So I feel like traumatic experiences tend to be unearthed when something outside of that triggers it, or somehow we're able to remember what that thing is. And sometimes we may still have a reaction and not be able to necessarily connect it to that traumatic event without some kind of assistance or some kind of support.
When trauma happens, one system in the body or several systems in the body can assume responsibility for containing the overwhelm. And that can keep us mostly functional while one system is compromised. It can keep us mostly in the orchestra of how we work, with part of our capacity unavailable. And often the body is able to do this so well that we're not even aware of this compromised kind of functioning, or we're not aware of it in someone else. But this can be a matter of the muscle system in a particular place in the body kind of holding what's too painful or too triggering to allow into the system. But the dysregulation in the body following trauma is actually an expression of the extraordinary way that parts of our body cooperate with each other so that we can keep going.
I think when the person is very connected to their physical body, they should feel somewhere, like shallow breathing or tightness or shaking, or even small things like shoulder tighten. That might be something like when we start paying attention, we might notice, oh, that's a trauma. It could be something somebody said to you when you're younger, but you don't even recognize, but your body reacts to that. Because that's what happened to me. Every time I see Carl, like, whoa, what was that reaction? I didn't know. That was from the car accident.
You just take a look at the kind of the evils that we discover in our society, and I strongly suspect that a lot of them are really based on unresolved trauma that has not been identified, much less addressed.
when we're looking at trauma on a societal level, I think we need to recognize that we've all been affected by it. And a little bit of kindness goes a long way. You know, somebody just cuts you off on the freeway or something like that. We don't know where they're going or what happened to them before that.
But we're all in this together. And if certain areas of the society are feeling, stressed and challenged and traumatized, then because we're all connected, we all feel that way.
Trauma is extremely difficult for any of us. And without the skill set to know that you don't have a choice to change what happened, but you do have a choice to know how to manage what happened in such a way that it actually becomes and can become a strong platform for who you become in the future.
I know that was a lot to take in. The stories of Jody, Andrew, Mary, and Lynn are heartbreaking with multiple layers of trauma. But each one of the storytellers in the series is here with us for a reason. Their journeys through trauma have led to personal growth that they never thought possible. And fortunately for us, a desire to share their wisdom in hopes of helping others. Post-traumatic growth is a topic we'll dig into in the series. But first, let's review what we just learned. Trauma is an emotional and sometimes physical scar from something that happened in the past. Trauma impacts our thinking and our nervous system. It can transform how we behave if we don't find a way to get it out. Healing trauma requires an integration of physical and mental work. Everyone experiences daily doses of small trauma. We just get used to it. Small, sustained traumas absorb into us over time and can do mental and physical damage we're not aware of. Many adult misbehaviors, such as addiction or even chronic illness, can be traced back to childhood trauma. You can't change what happened, but you can choose to manage what happened and make it a platform for who you become in the future. Finding meaning to your trauma is vital to working through it. Kindness and compassion go a long way towards healing trauma.
You've already heard Nick and some of our guests talk about childhood trauma. That's something we're going to spend a lot of time on in this series.
Everyone experiences a certain degree of trauma at childbirth, but we're talking about those formative years where we're turning to our parents, caretakers, and teachers for guidance.
I have empathy for this part. As a dad, I want to do what's best for my kids. I want to protect them, spoil them, teach them. It's all great in theory, but at the same time, it's pretty much trauma triage 24/7.
So it's just like regular life.
Basically, but with less sleep.
In this next segment, we're going to take a look at childhood trauma and the deep, long-lasting effects it can have on our mental and physical well-being. As kids, we don't have the ability to reason. We lose it a lot faster. The trials and tribulations of learning how the world works creates many micro-traumas for children. And then there are kids who suffer even more. Pedram's here with a segment about the effects of more severe childhood trauma.
Deep childhood trauma occurs when a child witnesses or has overwhelming negative experiences. Abuse, neglect, violence, betrayal. A child who experiences such things can have experienced bouts of sadness, anger, depression, anxiety, feeling that they don't belong anywhere. As adults, these symptoms can lead to depression, eating disorders, and substance abuse. If left untreated, it can also seep into our own parenting styles and continue an unhealthy cycle.
For me, I didn't really know that I had trauma until I was later on in life. And it wasn't until I started to investigate because of things that I was experiencing in my adult life that I realized that there were some traumas that I had. And I think that that was what was really difficult for me. Like, I didn't have physically abusive parents. I didn't have obvious sexual abuse. I didn't I didn't have a lot of the things that I had heard other people had when I was an adult.
Trauma can be described as any event that overwhelms us to the point where we are afraid for our lives or safety or the safety of others. But not everyone who experiences a traumatic event will have trauma or PTSD or complex trauma. Most people, by the way, that have PTSD have also had early childhood trauma, or what we call developmental trauma. Developmental trauma has to do with things that happen in critical periods of our development.
The perception is that trauma is a physical force that needs to be applied directly to the skull or the calvarium in order for it to create a trauma or a neurotrauma. But what we're finding is any kind of trauma below the neck can generate a group of chemicals which leak into the brain or are transported into the brain, which create an inflammation that we refer to as neuroinflammation that leads to disruption of the chemistry of the brain and therefore the functioning of the brain.
Going through a process of just unpacking based on certain things that I had been feeling in my body, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, that I started to realize that some things that I went through, like for instance with my sister, that was like a really physically and like emotionally abusive situation, and that there wasn't a lot of protection for me. And so the more that I started to share about it with like a therapist and with other people, the more feedback that I got, like, that's not normal. That's not what usually happens. Most people don't experience that.
You know, when I work with people, I don't put them into categories. They're suffering and they need help. And whether it's because they were in a car accident or because they were abused as a child or they were in a war zone, the same healing processes apply.
For me, it was a sense of realizing that this life that looked okay on the outside, I had two parents, they remained married, they were happily married, but like some of the things that I started to realize, for instance, that they never fought and they never expressed anger, or the anger was shoved down, and that there were a lot of these beliefs of like, you have to be nice, you have to be kind, you don't, it's you always prioritize like other people and like looking good or saying the right thing or being quiet over what's really true for you. And so I think like that over a long period of time had created a lot of, just trauma in my body. And then just, certain things that I had experienced with my sister were pretty traumatic. So like physically, abuse, and then emotional abuse of just constantly being told like that something wasn't right, or that I wasn't right, or I wasn't doing the right thing, or there was something wrong with me. I think that like mental abuse can take a toll.
Trauma occurs when somebody has an experience that is so deeply devastating to them on so many levels. It hurts their heart, it hurts their soul, it hurts their body, their spirit. They can lose a sense of themselves. They're being treated not as a human being. They're being treated with the opposite of what love is. And it's deeply, deeply painful. And that pain lasts. It doesn't go away. Just because they may be young when it happens, lots of times people think, oh, they won't remember. But they do. Even if it's repressed, the body remembers, the soul remembers, and it affects their whole lives.
Emotional trauma can be the result of many things. Important relationships, for example, with parents, family, friends, spouses, children. How difficult is it, say, compared to physical trauma or societal trauma?
Relational trauma just means trauma that happens in a relationship, trauma between people. One of the hardest kinds of trauma, really, because when we know that someone has or if we feel that someone has an intent to hurt us, it usually has more impact than an accident or something like that. So relational trauma could also mean betrayal in an intimate relationship. It could mean loss of trust in someone, an authority figure, or someone who has some kind of power over us. It could mean all kinds of things, but that's trauma that comes out of our connection, where there's a break in the connection in a very traumatic way.
You know, attempting to share it with my parents, like what was going on. And then that's when I started to learn about gaslighting, so that, you know, they would say, oh, everything's fine, or just be the wiser one, just be the more mature one, just don't let it bother you. And like for me, like as an adult, I started to notice like a lot of like anger come up, because it's like, no, like that's not right. You're not supposed to be told that. You're supposed to be told like, wow, I'm sorry that that's going on for you. Like, let's come up with a solution, you know. And the solution that they had was that, you know, because I would come home from school and she would just be waiting for me to, like, you know, like bats and knives, and like, you know, she was going through a lot in her own experience. And so, you know, she was just like coming after me. And so they would say, okay, well, we put a lock on your door so you can just run upstairs and go to your room. And I'm like, well, she's standing there waiting for me. There's really no place for me to go when I walk into the house.
Especially if there has been physical assault or lots and lots of stress and overload on the body, it gets stored in our muscles, in our fascia. Our body holds the trauma. Pre-verbally, when there are no thoughts, no words to even know the trauma, our body remembers. Our body holds that trauma.
So interestingly, I think for me, it caused me to start to do a lot of like coping mechanisms, which was just like playing sports and like overworking and like staying out of my house, not relaxing because I didn't feel like I could relax. And then that just caused a lot of burnout inside of me. And so when I was younger, I had like mono, I had like chronic fatigue syndrome. I think that started to manifest into the disease that I had when I was a kid. I think because my body was just holding so much and it didn't know what to do with it. And it didn't have that support that I really wanted or needed. For a long time, I had just probably gaslighted my own experience because I didn't think it was important enough or severe enough or traumatic enough to be able to like identify it or talk about it. It didn't seem like other people and what they had experienced. So I think I minimized and I shut it down. And I noticed that a lot of people that come to me, that they have a similar experience. They, you know, they may have had a decent home life or things seemed okay, but there were a lot of little things that started to happen and that started to create like trauma in their body. But for the most part, they may not think it's a traumatic event because it's not something like blatant, like physical abuse or sexual abuse or neglect. And so, you know, I feel like the small traumas, even though they're not as big as the big traumas, they still do add up and they really affect the way that we, you know, work in our life, the way that we live, the way we relate to ourselves and we relate to other people.
People can learn to love themselves, and that makes all the difference. And they can learn to connect with their higher guidance, and that makes all the difference. And I've just seen miracles happen with people who learn to see who they really are, not who they think they are, but who they really are, and that is what creates healing.
You served this country in the U.S. Army, Special Forces for several years, however many tours you did in Afghanistan, constantly exposed to levels of violence, all here hope never to see, frankly. Can you tell us a bit about what you went through and the impact it's had on you?
You know, in Special Forces, I was an elite performer in situations of life and death. So that was pretty much, you know, what that line of work calls for. And I was at the tip of the spear of that industry for a long time. After my last deployment, I started to have new problems that had never been apparent or existed before. And it came with extreme fatigue and loss of libido. And then I started to have some behavioral issues, started to just become overwhelmed with depression. And I was living the life I wanted to live as a special forces operator, as married to the woman of my dreams. We had the family we wanted, but like, I'm like swimming in this new sea of depression. And for the life of me, it didn't add up. And it wasn't like, oh, I'm feeling a little bit down today. It was like waking up to find out like your family had been murdered.
There were some fMRI studies done on brains that looked at people that reported in a perceived stress scale being chronically overwhelmed and stressed. They actually had the same shrinkage in the prefrontal cortex, the front part, the executive function, adult brain, so brain damage basically, as people that had PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. You can have complex PTSD, you can have PTSD. So there can be complex trauma and then trauma with a lowercase t. And oftentimes, I say everybody has had trauma. Everybody has experienced trauma. And a lot of people don't recognize it because it's not the capital T trauma.
So in addition to the depression, I started having anxiety, panic attacks, have all kinds of cognitive issues, problems with my speech, then physiological problems with my balance and things like that. So life slowly, or not slowly, but rather fast, quickly spiraled out of control.
A topic that I get asked a lot about is PTS or PTSD, post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, which they don't think is a disorder, it's just post-traumatic stress. And it's interesting that the Department of Defense has defined it as either witnessing or experiencing or participating in a visual event or having been witness to something that is so horrifying that it creates this emotional turpitude and leads to depression, schizophrenia, and all these other things.
The military model for that, or I guess the medical industrial model, is psychotherapy and medication. But it was the fact that I had all these new psychological diagnoses, and I had never had issues with that before, and I wasn't hung up in anything that I had done operationally. I didn't want to get out of deployment. I wasn't looking for a free ticket on the outside. I just wanted to put this behind me and go back to doing what I thought I was put here to do, or what I knew I was put here to do, is go back to my work.
The real issue is in the definition that the Department of Defense has made with what is traumatic brain injury and what isn't. And the criteria is too restrictive. You have to have loss of consciousness, you have to have retrograde amnesia, you have to have nausea, vomiting, you have to have personality change and so forth. But 85% of the people who have traumatic brain injury never have knocked down to the ground. They never develop amnesia. So the criteria, if it's not met, what's the next category? And the next category is post-traumatic stress.
It was a crazy time with all the head injuries and all the, before we were able to identify it and chart a course to correcting it. But I became like an independent observer, detached from my body, but experiencing it like do things. And it was like, I had no control over it. It was the most bizarre and frightening thing. And it would produce things that I would never consciously be a part of.
People have different ways of defending against the feeling states that come up with trauma. Sometimes they kind of are cut off from their bodies and they live in their heads. And we see people that are very intellectual, very smart. They can talk about trauma, they can talk about all the theories, but they're not connected to themselves. They have no idea when you ask, what are you feeling? Or what are the sensations in your bodies? Nothing. I don't feel anything. So starting to just get people in touch with their own body and what they're feeling inside of themselves and what they might desire or need, or allowing themselves to need or want something. That's one of the things that's taken away with trauma.
The treatment protocols that we use started out back in the late 90s, where we started finding patients who were coming to us with personality changes. And at that time, didn't really see the relationship between a history of trauma, reduction in hormones, and the occurrence of psychiatric or psychological changes. So in our treatment, we support the patient with hormones while we're treating the neuroinflammation or the inflammation in the brain. And what we found is there are a number of natural products out there that selectively can drop these inflammatory chemicals in the brain.
So you couple that with then all the medication. I was put on over 13 different medications, a lot of them psychotropics, and things that just kind of zombified me. And in the end, I was far worse than when I started. So those medications seemed to just exacerbate the problem. And so I started drinking heavily.
Take whiskey, if you take the medications that we're given, anything that we're self-medicating with, whether it be prescription or non-prescription, but something that's putting us to sleep. It's basically saying, I'm in anguish, I'm in pain, I can drink my whiskey, I can take the pills that my doctor gave me, and I'm not going to feel that pain. But it doesn't mean that I'm good, it doesn't mean I'm right, it doesn't mean I'm experiencing life. It just means I'm literally going to sleep this thing out. It'd be the equivalent in my mind of saying, you know what, life is overwhelming, life sucks, I don't feel good about myself, I feel threatened by the world, any of those numbers of things, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just go to sleep, and I'm going to try to stay asleep because I never want to wake up and feel that again. That's what all that is doing. It's putting you to sleep.
And again, so when it happens over and over and over, and seeing it to the detriment of the people I love, the negative effects to my family just absolutely devastated me.
In my mind, what we all want to do and what humanity needs more than anything else right now is to wake up. How can I now wake up? Can I wake up to the fact that I did some bad things and I want to make that right? Can I wake up to the fact that I'm living wrong right now? If I stay on the track I'm on, I had horrible traumas that have happened to me and I've never dealt with them, whether they be physical, whether they be emotional, whether they be biochemical, where I've eaten bad for all this time, whatever it might be. But can I just somehow now finally wake up and take positive action to put my life on a different and better path and allow my life expression to be what I'm born to be, which is happy, which is healthy, and which is to have a purpose, to be here to do something. And if I can get to that, then I think I've got a fulfilled life. It's like, and I look at it, people say I'm just going to get in bed and never wake up again.
So you have all those things going for you, or not going for you. So all the symptoms that were there, coupled with all the psychotropic medication, drinking heavily on top of that, probably not sleeping, not eating adequately. It's just a breeding ground for disaster. And I got to that point where I thought, it would be better if I didn't exist anymore.
They're given a lifestyle of non-functioning on medication or barely functioning and on medication. They lose their families, which is a great cry that I have, is how many of these guys who have lost their families because the personality changes that occurred. And that's reversed. We have cases where they've gone back to their significant other, or significant other said, whoa, this is now the husband I married, or this is the guy that I married. And that's my joy, is every day that I'm on the phone or doing Skype calls or doing video conferencing with the patients, their significant other is there and says, this is great, it's working. But how many people that are on the traditional conventional approach can actually say that? I'm better, but I can't function. And it's better that they use is how intrusive is the depression they have into their ability to function. A lot of the guys are sitting on their couches or in a chair watching television, thinking of what to do next. And it's not always good.
I could take on the pain, I can take on burdens and things like that, but living with the understanding that I was just potentially damaging them, and even long term, just didn't sit right with me. And I would go through these episodes, like I lost the ability to, I wouldn't react appropriately to, certain situations, like whether it's, getting in fights in public, or, making a normal interaction with somebody, turning it physical or in an argument. There was no reason for it, but it would end up that way, and that's indicative of frontal lobe damage. But I would go through these, I had this uncontrollable rage, just uncontrollable. It's just the worst thing ever, man, because like you feel like completely amped up. I'm this fit guy, and like I just felt like I had all this energy, and it wasn't like happy. It was pure unadulterated rage. Didn't want it to be there, and when it would come on, I would just go upstairs in our closet in our bedroom, and I would lock myself in the closet, and I would just stay there in the fetal position. Sometimes hours at a time. And I thought, like, I can't go on like this. You know what I mean? And so that's I would take my gun with me and I'd put it in my mouth, and I really thought about it.
We're going to hear a lot more from Andrew about his journey of living with multiple types of trauma he experienced while he was deployed. Whether it's violent physical traumas like Andrew's, or an accident or assault, or a series of cumulative smaller traumas experienced in childhood, the experience manifests itself in not just a mental sense, but physically as well. From Gwen's mono as a kid, or Andrew's slurred speech and mental fog, there's a strong correlation between chronic illness and unresolved trauma. We'll dig more into this in a later episode. For now, here's some key takeaways from what we just learned. Most people who suffer PTSD also have unresolved childhood traumas, whether they know it or not. Not everyone who experiences a traumatic event will have PTSD. Trauma gets stored in our cells, and if we hold on to that stress, it can literally change our bodies. Poor posture, headaches, digestive issues, and many more. Trauma can lead to an individual losing their sense of self. Diet and natural supplements often have better results for trauma relief than prescription drugs. Love and compassion heals trauma better than anything. People can learn to love themselves, and that makes all the difference when they see who they really are and not who they think they are. Please take a moment and share this series with your family and friends right now. As you've already seen, this information is critical to helping explain, confront, and ultimately heal from our trauma. Let's face it, this is hard work, and we're just getting started. But nobody can heal your trauma except you. Loving yourself is important, and it starts now by taking action. I had a cousin commit suicide, and at the time, none of us saw it coming. This conversation around trauma wasn't happening, and we didn't know the signs. Trust me, there are at least a couple people in your life that are thinking about suicide right now. It's a real problem, and we are committed to helping solve it. We've created the Trauma Series to provide you with actionable items that can help you heal. You owe it to yourself to watch it all. Take notes and pass it on. Please share this broadly. This episode will be up for 24 hours, so please act now, share now. Thank you. We're so excited to have you on this journey with us. This episode cuts deep. Some of the stories are difficult to watch, but to see these people doing the work and improving, that's inspiring.
And it's evolving. Trauma might be at an all-time high, but so are the various treatments for healing it.
Diet, neuroplastics, EFT, EMDR, meditation, yoga. These are just a few of the new and ancient techniques that are being employed to help heal trauma, and the methodologies behind all of them are here in this series for you.
We're living through some crazy times. Fear and insecurity are constantly being pumped into our system, and it's easy to become overwhelmed.
And that's not even taking into account whatever early traumas you're holding on to. We're just talking about what hits you when you get out of bed.
I gotta tell you, this is why I get out of bed every day. Paying this knowledge forward is a gift.
It really is. We hope you stay with us as we break down the different types of traumas, the effects they have on our mind and body, and most importantly, the steps and methods we can take to heal. Until next time,
be well.